And so as women are, locking down, their boyfriends by going steady, in hopes of landing a mate, what we have during this time period is, as your book notes, we see a dip in age of first marriage, and we do have people getting married earlier. Um, Not necessarily, it was not necessarily, though, that these marriages were happier or more stable. And so to discuss that, before we discuss that, let's talk about the role that separate spheres probably played here. So Talcott Parsons, who is a sociologist, and he was in the 1950s and he was big on functionalism. He argued that traditional gender roles play a functional role in US society, that they help our society function smoothly. And he says that's because we split men and women into instrumental versus expressive roles. So men are instrumental, they're part of the public sphere, they're making money, they're making decisions in businesses, they're making decisions in our political arena. And women have expressive roles, meaning they are making, people in their lives feel good, they're taking care of them, they're raising children, they're making, private, homes livable and beautiful and comfortable for the men. And he was like, and by allowing, men to focus on their instrumental roles and women to focus on their expressive roles, this allows for smooth functioning in society because, men aren't having to worry about doing the expressive things. Women don't have to worry about doing the instrumental things. And doesn't this sound just good for everyone? And so before I get into the clear cost associated with these traditional gender roles and in these traditional marriages, are there some benefits? Certainly. In terms of amount of time spent, we know that, and this is true even today, that the amount of time that, women who are stay at home, wives and mothers, that they oftentimes, the amount of time that they spend doing work, paid or unpaid, it is not as many hours as women who are both working, as well as in families where they're responsible for the bulk of the second and third shift. And although these working mothers, oftentimes in surveys indicate a higher amount of satisfaction, they also are more likely to indicate, that they are, don't have enough time in the day. They aren't sure if they're doing either role well, if they're being the best worker, if they're being the best mother, if they're being the best wife. And there is this sense it's because that they are getting spread too thin. And for men, of course, the benefit of the instrumental role versus the expressive role is you have someone in your life that is dedicated solely to caretaking, to making sure that you're fed and that your home is clean and that your children are well taken care of. But of course, and not having to concern yourself with these things, which allows you to focus more, it allows you to focus solely on work. But, there are costs there for men as well. And so we're going to talk about the cost of traditional gender roles, the cost of separate spheres. And so maybe unsurprisingly, a lot of these costs initially seem to come from the women's point of view. And your book mentions that The Feminine Mystique, which was published in 1963 by Betty Friedan, addressed this question about why, women weren't happy, why being in the private sphere, not working, how it led to this feeling of like dissatisfaction. And in her book, she calls it the problem that has no name. And it's not just that, these spheres that are separate and unequal, because one becomes devalued because it's not income producing the way the other is. But, this gender stratification existed in all elements of life, that even though it was no longer the the patriarchal property marriage, women weren't allowed to necessarily, rent their own apartments, or, be in certain occupations, or, attend certain colleges, or attend college at all. They weren't allowed to open their own banking account or have a credit card without their husband's permission. And so, with this forced dependency and these limitations, your book notes that even though people were now marrying for love, the separate sphere ideology drained the life out of the friendships people had before marriage, and they found themselves unhappy. And so it's not just, women, but because men were kind of, forced into this position of being the sole provider, the separate spheres made it hard for men to do anything but work for money outside of the home. Their primary role was to be a good provider. And so obviously this put stress on men who weren't able to provide. The pressures of being what's considered a big wheel, where masculinity is measured by power, success, wealth, and status. This had an impact on men's self-esteem and sense of self-worth if they weren't upholding that ideal. They were encouraged to focus time and energy away from family. And, we know from qualitative data interviews of men who were fathers during this time period, that oftentimes one of their biggest regrets is the impact that this had on their family ties, particularly with their children. If you're told that the main way that you are being a good father is by making money, and that should be your sole focus, just think about all that you miss out on. What Parsons labels as being expressive, those feelings, those relationships, in a lot of ways, isn't that what gives our life meaning? So, men, there was a cost to separate spheres for men as well. And of course the cost for women, as a lot of that's what I've already noted. In a society where more value is on paid work, caring for children in the home is often devalued. And so, women were not seen as being equal contributors in their own homes as well as in larger society. They weren't afforded the same level of respect that men received. Once again, that would be both in their own homes as well as in larger society. And of course, this is what's called a prescriptive ideal rather than descriptive, meaning, this was during the time period, this was the image that was held up that women should be. But, there are always women who are unable to hold up that image, to uphold that image, even if they wanted to. And so it's worth noting that working class, immigrant women who are racial minorities, much more of them were participating in that public sphere. But what's interesting is they were participating in the public sphere, they were working, but then there was still this expectation that they should be doing this expressive role in their families as well. So, for these women, they were our first wave of women that were experiencing this kind of second shift, this sense that the work is never done because they're doing both this paid labor and this unpaid labor, that the fact that they were working did not mean that their husbands and their children had any less expectations of them in the home sphere. And these women, and this is oftentimes a critique of the second wave of feminism, which most people kind of designate as being jump-started by Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. She was not interested in the lives of these working class, racial minority women who, their problems had names, right? They did not have the problem with no name. They had problems like, having to work in order to afford to live, afford to raise their families. But, all of this, unhappy men, unhappy women, we can see it in some of the behaviors that start to become more dominant during this time period. Your book talks about the rise of premature babies, teen pregnancies, alcoholism and among men and women, pill popping, particularly among the bored housewives, the creation of the Playboy image. Because it's during this time period in 1953 that you have the creation of the Playboy magazine, and it was meant to push back on this idea that, you know, men who don't marry, there's inherently something wrong or unnatural with them. It was a pushback against this expectation that men should have these instrumental roles, that they should be breadwinners, you know, and instead kind of said, you know, no, you know, for men that felt constrained and by that choice, you know, Hugh Hefner was presenting this alternative lifestyle. I've already discussed Betty Friedan and the problem that has no name. But maybe the best kind of piece of evidence that despite what we might like to tell ourselves about this time period, clearly there was some unhappiness, is this is when we first kind of see the first kind of spike in you know, divorces. You know, you can start to see the divorces starting to climb already in the early 1960s, coming out of the 1950s. And then of course, you know, once no fault divorce laws were passed, where basically you could divorce without needing a reason, you know, you see that dramatic spike. But that is happening because these were people that were married during the 50s, and they were unhappy. And the government kind of responded to that spike, as your textbook discussed. You know, they responded, you know, to displaced homemakers by doing things like requiring alimony and making divorce legally difficult. But this did not stymie the rather high rate of people seeking divorce coming out of the 1950s. You know, other kind of signs that, you know, the 1950s were not the golden age that TV Nick at Night might lead you to believe, is the fact that, you know, even with that push for the breadwinner housewife marriage model, more women were working more than ever before, you know, despite the breadwinner policies that tried to push women out of the labor force. Some women pushed back. They refused to go back to being solely in the private sphere, even if it wasn't financially necessary. Some women just chose to work. Obviously, there are issues regarding race during the 1950s. The family wage was elusive for most men of color. A lot of that relating to lack of opportunities in the education as well as job spheres. Discrimination in the labor market, as noted by the textbook. Despite their service, the GI Bill and the VA housing loans, they largely either excluded or limited the benefits to African American veterans in particular. And so those families, you know, racial minority families, but as well as just some working class, working poor, white, particularly white immigrant families, they needed two incomes even back then. And so the economy, and then just, you know, like I said, post World War II, America is during an economic boom. We have a booming economy. So we have plenty of available jobs and we need people to work them. So, you know, the economy needed workers, even though at some, you know, at the same time they need workers, and therefore that did lead to them turning to women to work those jobs. At the same time, policies were put in place to try to discourage or limit women's workplace participation. In particular, you know, your book talks about marriage bans, how some occupations just flat out banned married women from holding those jobs. And then for other types of jobs, instead of marriage bans, they would do they would pass laws that we would consider to be, or we would call, protective legislation. And so protective legislation is a form of benevolent sexism. They were supposedly laws put into place to protect women from dangerous jobs, from doing night work, from, working long hours. But in a lot of ways, these jobs that were supposedly designed to protect women, what they often, the larger goal was really to restrict and limit their workplace participation. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made these types of policies, protective legislation, marriage bans, it made them illegal. And, there is this story behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it was really meant to originally kind of focus on solely on race and ethnicity. And there's this story that senator added sex to the legislation in hopes that it would kill it. That people that there's no way that they would agree that women have this legal constitutional right to not be discriminated against. But it passed. And now, of course, there is some debate, if whether or not that senator's actions are being wrongly interpreted. And if you're interested in that backstory and the debate around that backstory, I give you 2 articles that kind of present both sides of the story. But the thing about the Civil Rights Act, and this is true really almost of any federal legislation that's passed, is that enforcement of the law was not automatic. So, women have not made, it was not easy, automatic acceptance into these occupations. It's not like women immediately became free from workplace discrimination. But certainly, the passage of that law, along with, of course, all of the kind of movements that were taking place in the 60s and 70s, civil rights movement, and then, women's movement, and then the sexual revolution happened. All of these things, of course, are going to, impact that popular conception around love and marriage, right? So we're back to, what does it look like today? What type of shift has occurred? And so, if we think about the modern marriage, despite there being concern about the decline of marriage, and there has been a decline, there are more single people than ever before. And of that group, there is a growing percentage of people who are never married. But despite that fact, most people in America still get married, and marriage still remains one of the most important aspects of an individual's life, from kind of this symbolic socio-psychological perspective. However, and it's still an important part of a person's identity, right? Their identity as a husband, as a wife, as a spouse. People who are married still list that as being that identity as having real personal as well as social significance. But why people pursue marriage today, those reasons have become a lot more individualistic. They've become more self-centered, less practical, less family focused. So it's not like you're marrying someone because your parents want you to. In most cases, it's not like you're marrying someone because you financially have to. Nowadays, a lot of people say things like they're marrying, someone because they love them, or, it's just they want to be married, personal goal fulfillment. They see it as an integral part of their happiness. And at the same time, there are more life choices available for individuals today if they choose to not marry. But what do those marriages look like? Well, as we've transitioned from an industrial economy to a post-industrial economy, and your textbook describes this as a service and information economy. Most of us aren't working with our hands and in factories anymore. We're working either in the service industry, or we're working as information workers, which is a broad category of work. But, especially for the information workers, those types of jobs oftentimes require investment in education, higher education. And so this has led to the transition to what's called the idealized partnership marriage. Or another way to think about this, to use a term that's come up before in this class, is, this is our egalitarian love, right? It's the love between two equals, and it's the expectation that in this marriage, you're going to share the responsibility for paid labor, you're going to share the responsibility for housework, you're going to share the responsibility for childcare. Now, to what extent is this true? And we'll talk about this more in upcoming chapters, but, you can kind of see that, while women are participating more in paid work than their predecessors, and men are participating more in childcare and housework than their predecessors, there is still this large gender gap in terms of who is doing what in marriages. So, the ideal is this partnership, this partnership between equals. But what happens in reality is not that straightforward. And this is the case, even though the marriage contract itself, your textbook notes, has become more gender neutral. And so, what does that mean, that the marriage contract itself has become more gender neutral? That means that, for the most part, marriage provides the same rights and responsibilities to men and women. Both men and women are now responsible for paying alimony if they get a divorce, to whichever spouse spent time outside of the workforce to take care of family. A male widower can now collect his wife's Social Security check instead of his own. Before, they noted in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, only wives could do that. So if you were a man and your wife died and she happened to be working, you would not have been eligible to collect her Social Security. The government just kept that. And now, of course, men do have that right. Men no longer have special rights to manage the family money, right? It's now considered to be joint partnership. And even though your textbook says that, nearly all states now confer equal standing to both spouses in issues of child custody, that one is still dicey. That's probably one of the areas where women still do, benefit from some very traditional gendered notions about mothering and just, maternal instinct, while men and women are likely to get joint custody, especially if male and female are, parents are divorcing and they're seeking sole or primary custody. In a lot of cases, oftentimes women still have the edge in most of those family court proceedings. And so what this means is individual couples now have a lot of freedom comparative to the past and how they organize their lives, whether or not they want to be family focused or work focused, dual earners, whether or not, one person is going to stay at home and the other person is going to work, and that person that's working could be male or female. Obviously, with Obergefell-Hodges, we have the constitutionality and the protection of gay marriage in all states. There's the increased role of grandparents and people turning to grandparents to provide child care services. And this is kind of a callback to centuries ago, where the focus was less on the nuclear family and more on the extended family, and reliance on extended family and kin to help provide care work. There are people that live together apart, so you marry, but you don't necessarily share the same household, or you don't share the same primary household. We've already talked about the fact we have more people just remaining single, the rise of the never marrieds. We still have a high rate of single parenthood, including single parenthood by choice, right? So it's not just that, someone knocked you up and then, refused a shotgun wedding, or, they left you, but it's the fact that there are increasing numbers of people who are choosing to become parents on their own. And then, of course, there is the fact that, although divorce rates have not continued to increase, they have stagnated at a fairly high level. And then, of course, the fact that oftentimes when people get divorced, they oftentimes remarry. So we have the creation of, what your book refers to as the marriage go round, and the fact that these remarriages oftentimes introduce different family relations. So we have the rise of blended families, which is what I think I was going to write for that final bullet that I did not finish my thought. So, the kind of ending quote, marriage is less necessary than it was in the past. And the primary reason to marry in Western culture is for love, which makes it both more voluntary and less stable. And so the institution of marriage, hopefully this chapter made it clear it's changed over time, and it's likely to continue to do so over our lifetimes. So, despite, people's tendency to look back at past time periods with nostalgia, the fact of the matter is, these institutions have continuously changed, and they will continue to change.